Our first presenter, Mary Pickering, the Vice President of Program Partnerships at the Atmospheric Fund and a member of the TransformTO project team.
Thank you, Stuart. And thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight. My role at Atmospheric Fund is to support, work with the city to support achieving long-term climate actions. And we're very happy tonight to be here with you to explain a little bit about the report and the recommendations and to hear what you have to say in terms of questions and comments. So please do keep those coming using the instructions that Stuart has provided. Tonight we're going to talk about an overview of this project, what we found out, the recommendations, action areas, a summary, and the next steps. And then after that we'll have our Q&A. I'm just going to start here with giving people a sense of where this project is on a timeline. We have been working on this initiative for 2 years already, starting with a council endorsement in May of 2015. I just wanted to convey that there's been a lot of activity over this period to build up the information we used to create the report, including some very important community engagement that where we spoke to 2,000 residents to get their views. We also did some technical modeling, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail, a couple of scenarios and 4 technical papers. And we did some serious consideration of co-benefits associated with low carbon action. So quite a bit of research, quite a bit of consultation. And this was all supported by a 35-member community-based team who helped us every step of the way to assess the information and develop advice to support the recommendations. Next steps, this goes to council. It goes first to the Parks and Environment Committee, and if it's approved there, to City Council. And the plan that we have put forward is a long-term plan that will unfold over the next decade and beyond. Just to give you some context, there's really 2 key questions that we were asking as part of this work, of the TransformTO work. They're on the screen here. First of all, we're focusing on how we could achieve the 2050 climate target. What actions would need to be undertaken? A second question of equal importance for this work is how those low carbon actions that we identify might drive community benefit. So bear these questions in mind as we move forward and talk about this project, which has really a couple of these 2 important lenses. I'm going to let you know about what we really found out here. I guess the first finding is that we understand that collaboration is key to advancing low carbon strategy in Toronto. We know that from the practice taken in other global cities doing this work, based on research done by an international agency, ARIP, that those cities that are undertaking collaborative approaches to their work are achieving their carbon actions at twice the rate as others. So we've taken this to heart, and here on this slide, I just want to talk a little bit about this approach that we've taken in this 2-year phase. I've mentioned that we've done some preliminary engagement with 2,000 residents. We have 10 city divisions involved, so we're collaborating across our own city divisions. The 35-member advisory group, which included representatives with expertise in public health, local economy, social equity, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. We have a consortia of over a dozen people with facilitation, modeling, and other technical skills to help us with the research. And we also received funding support from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, who sees this project as something valuable to share across the country with other cities. In terms of the scenarios, we had 2. The first looked at what would happen if we took all the leadership action the city is already doing, our amazing official plan, our amazing waste reduction plan that we put forward this year, our transit plans. We looked at all of that and we modeled it out to 2050 and found that there's still a major gap. 8.7 million tons. So this finding is that if even despite all the good work we're doing, there's still a major opportunity here to pick up the pace. In fact, we must pick up the pace in order to reach our target. In terms of the 2050 goal, which is an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050, compared to 1990 baseline, the scenario shows us that this is technically feasible. It requires no new technology, all existing technology. It can be done. And while there is a suite of measures that must be implemented, 36 actions in all, there are some measures that have a very high potential to move the dial. And this pie chart shows you what those measures are. We're talking about energy efficiency in buildings. That's stopping the energy waste in our building stock, in changing our transportation fuel to electricity, in undertaking new approaches to energy delivery at the community scale with low carbon sources of fuel, increased waste diversion, and more active transportation and transit. There's a lot of, I'm going to tell you in a minute what scale and pace we need to advance those actions I just mentioned in that pie chart. But when we do advance those actions, we've also found that there is potential for a lot of other community benefits to be achieved. Here on this slide, these are 5 key areas of benefits that we examined with our modeling advisory group using a multi-criteria analysis exercise and through literature review and studies that Toronto Public Health did in partnership with us on this project. It's a very important opportunity for public health because we can reduce pollution if we remove a significant portion of our fossil fuel transportation fuel. It gives us some community resilience improvements. There's some major energy cost savings to be had. In fact, we estimate a average reduction of 50% on household energy costs by 2050. Productivity, innovation, and competitiveness for advancing new low-carbon approaches. A lot of jobs and local investment opportunities, and more access to transportation to improve quality of life for Toronto residents. Finally, we do need to invest, but we will see returns. And many of the reductions that we modeled, in fact, about 2/3, will pay back over the period from between here and 2050. And that's payback calculated through avoided capital maintenance, energy, and carbon pricing costs. We have not calculated the important benefits we may receive in other areas. These investments will be front-end loaded, and they will be longer term in paying back. I just want to talk a little bit about the recommendations. That's the findings we received in a very short way. This is all elaborated in the staff report and in our popular report, if you would like to access those online. And they have supported our key recommendations. The first area of recommendation is that we are asking the City of Toronto to acknowledge and embrace the scale and pace of effort that will be needed in the 2050 timeframe to achieve low-carbon Toronto and the associated benefits. And on this slide, we're talking about specific areas. Certainly, buildings are key. We need all new buildings to be built to near net zero standards starting in 2030. And over the course of this time period, we need to look at retrofits of all city buildings and get an average 40% reduction in their energy use. We're also going to be heating and cooling buildings using more district energy fueled by low carbon sources such as waste heat and deep lake water. We're going to be driving a mode shift for trips under 5 kilometers, so people will be increasing their physical activity. We're setting a new, proposing a new interim goal for the GHG emissions, 65% reduction by 2030. We're looking to get 75% of our energy in the city from renewables by 2050. And we're going to be looking at reducing fossil fuels for our transportation by 2050 and drastically reducing our waste production with a 95% diversion rate. So those are the scale and pace recommendations in the report. We are also suggesting that the city consider positioning itself as a leader. It's already a leader, but taking on some new goals in line with this new scale and pace is another set of recommendations we are proposing, and they are elaborated here and in more detail in the report. We need facilities that are owned by the city to comply with these higher energy performance standards. We need the city to take the opportunity to develop renewable energy on its own facilities and to get its own fleet into low-carbon vehicles, to give attention to our own performance in terms of waste diversion, in terms of renewable energy development from biogas. And we are also wanting to see the city position itself as a top green employer. This all requires a shift to a new approach. As we elaborated at the beginning, this is about advancing low carbon in tandem with other important goals that the city already has on its books. And here is a list. I'm not going to read this out, but this is a list of the kind of directions the city has in its other strategies. And we are looking to work with our city colleagues and across the community to explore and advance low carbon strategies that also advance these kinds of goals. We're looking to report on a regular basis on the outcomes of this work, should it be confirmed by City Council, and that would include updates on TransformTO key performance indicators, which are elaborated in the report, progress towards the city's own leadership goals, and regular development of revisions and additions as this plan evolves with input from the community. Now, I'm going to hand the microphone to Linda Swanson, and she's going to tell you a little bit about some of our proposed action areas.
Thank you, Mary. And thank you everyone again for joining us this evening. My name is Linda Swanson, and I've been involved in the TransformTO project for the last 2 years as the project lead. And I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of the action areas that are included in TransformTO Report 2. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, you can submit them through the question and answer function, labeling them to all panelists on the WebEx platform. You'll find that function in the bottom right corner of your screen. You can also tweet at LiveGreenTO or at Atmospheric Fund with the hashtag TransformTO. To achieve the forecasted 5 million ton GHG reduction by 2050, Toronto must follow through on planned low-carbon actions. Getting Toronto on the path to a low-carbon future requires coordination on 3 fronts. We must follow through on the implementation of existing low-carbon actions. We must implement and fund the Report 1 short-term strategies approved by Council in December 2016 as part of the TransformTO project. And we also propose the initiation of 3 acceleration campaigns to create community benefit while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The following slides present how these 3 elements converge in Toronto's urban systems to catalyze transformation. Just as cities are critical to achieving provincial and federal low-carbon goals, neighborhoods are essential to creating and implementing municipal low-carbon solutions. Low-carbon neighborhoods are a key area of action. In terms of following through on planned actions, the TransformTO low-carbon scenario identified that the majority of growth in Toronto is happening in areas identified for growth in the official plan and supports neighborhoods that are vibrant in complete communities. Similarly, the proposed citywide rapid transit network that is already planned must be implemented to reach our low-carbon goal. City Council approved 2 neighborhood-focused strategies in the December TransformTO report: the continuation of TransformTO neighborhood engagement and the enhancement of the Live Green Toronto to focus on deep energy savings in residential neighborhoods. However, we know from community engagement, technical analysis, and recommendations from the TransformTO advisory group that neighborhoods are truly essential to reaching our goal, and therefore we're proposing an acceleration campaign in this report too, focusing on mobilizing low-carbon neighborhoods. TransformTO's Community Engagement and Modeling Advisory Group called for ways for residents to participate in the city's low-carbon plan within their own neighborhoods, and identified that residents feel that at the neighborhood scale they have the familiarity and agency needed to suggest and advance local action in line with citywide low-carbon goals. This acceleration campaign can capture the significant resources represented within and across Toronto's diverse neighborhoods to support residents in developing their own flexible, innovative, low-carbon solutions that can help people live better lives. Many low-carbon actions can be considered at the neighborhood scale. For example, community energy planning looks at efficient use of energy through local shared energy services. As Toronto undertakes public transit and active transportation infrastructure build-out, there's an opportunity to work with local communities to maximize the usefulness and the use of these investments through programming, outreach, and engagement. The objectives of this Mobilize Low Carbon Neighborhoods campaign include advancing best practices in neighborhood-based engagement, cultivating local leaders, identifying how TransformTO initiatives could improve affordability and support the city's poverty reduction and social development strategies, and explore how neighborhood-scale TransformTO initiatives could enhance community resilience and take action with 3 to 5 quick start projects. As we saw earlier, transportation offers a significant opportunity for greenhouse gas emission reductions. And as we seek transformation in Toronto's urban systems, expanding mobility options and embracing electrification will be key. The TransformTO low-carbon scenario demonstrates an annual potential reduction of 3,000 kilotons from transit and active transportation infrastructure expansion and electrification of transportation. To reach the long-term goal, Toronto must follow through with planned investment in active transportation infrastructure as outlined in the 10-year cycle network plan and deliver planned and approved public transit investments. Council has already approved in TransformTO Report 1 strategies to advance sustainable transportation, including developing a low-carbon freight strategy that seeks to address in an integrated way urban freight movement and its impacts on congestion, business continuity, and air quality, and also to enable electric vehicles. As the electrification of mobility offers the greatest additional emission reduction potential in Toronto's transportation system, TransformTO recommends an acceleration campaign to prepare for electric mobility. This kind of acceleration campaign offers significant opportunities. We see that the conversion to electric mobility can both produce significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and local air pollutants that negatively affect the health of Toronto residents. However, the move to electrification also represents potential challenges and opportunities to our electricity and grid management. In seeking to prepare for electric mobility, the campaign's objectives would be to convene the necessary stakeholders to co-develop an electric vehicle transition strategy for Toronto, develop an electric vehicle charging infrastructure strategy to make sure that people can fuel up in an electric vehicle as easily as they need to, identify best practices in electric vehicle preparedness to ensure equitable outcomes for all residents and that mobility is accessible to all, prioritize electrical vehicle approaches that maximize community benefit, and launch quick start projects to test the implications of electric vehicle use for the local grid and local grid resilience. As Mary mentioned, greenhouse gas emissions connected with our building sector are one of, if not the largest, source of greenhouse gas emissions in Toronto. In fact, over half of greenhouse gas emissions in Toronto come from the operation of our residential, commercial, and institutional buildings, primarily from the natural gas we use to heat our space and our water. Increasing the energy performance of existing buildings and ensuring that new ones are built to high standards is the primary focus of the TransformTO low-carbon scenario. The low-carbon scenario demonstrates that efficiency gains in existing buildings and high-performance new construction can present almost 4,000 kilotons of greenhouse gas emission reduction potential. TransformTO Report 1 that has been approved advanced a number of strategies to support energy efficiency in buildings that are critical for picking up the pace including the continued development of the existing Toronto Green Standard, requiring new construction to meet higher levels of energy performance than the Ontario Building Code, and also a new zero-emissions building framework being developed in Toronto, the details of which will be provided to Council in the fall of 2017. Enhancing the Better Building Partnership is an important strategy that's already been improved to deliver energy retrofits in commercial and institutional buildings, and support for residential property owners through the HELP and high-rise programs that on average to date have delivered the kind of deep energy efficiency retrofits up to the 40% of energy savings modeled that would be necessary to achieve the buildings-related TransformTO low-carbon goals. That said, TransformTO has identified a significant opportunity to align workforce development programs with low-carbon building initiatives and further accelerate efficiency gains and emission savings in Toronto's building sector. The Develop the Workforce for High-Performance Building campaign seeks to advance the level of activity that would be required to achieve the 2050 target while driving major local employment opportunities, generating an estimated within the model 80,000 person-years of employment between now and 2050. Building retrofit activity is also synergistic with social housing renewal and can offer important health benefits to residents through improved indoor air quality. The key objectives of the third campaign to develop the workforce for high-performance buildings include creating a building energy performance strategy, identifying priority approaches to drive community benefit, including an early focus on social housing renewal, developing a workforce strategy with stakeholder input across the City of Toronto, including the community and other divisions, supporting a highly skilled workforce to deliver the high-performance buildings that are needed, and at the same time creating opportunities who may face barriers to employment. Improving the resilience of Toronto's building stock to extreme weather in events and power disruptions is another objective of this particular acceleration campaign. By continuing to support distributed renewable energy generation and developing low-carbon district energy systems like deep lake water cooling or waste heat recovery, Toronto is in a position to advance the adoption of renewable and community energy approaches. The low-carbon scenario identified that over 1,000 kilotons of reduction potential have been identified through energy system transformation. In December, Council adopted 3 short-term strategies to move us towards our long-term goals in this area, including advancing community energy planning, in which there are currently 4 planning studies underway where the City is investigating in partnership with community members the potential to be net zero communities, the need to advance low-carbon renewable and thermal energy networks across the City, and also we identified in the first report that creating a renewable energy strategy is the first step to realizing the renewable energy generation potential in Toronto of technologies like solar photovoltaic and geothermal. The Workforce Development for High-Performance Buildings Acceleration Campaign will be important in also advancing these renewable and community energy approaches, and will both consider and align with these efforts. The final urban system that is important for Toronto reaching its long-term low-carbon goals is the efforts towards a virtual elimination of waste. City Council adopted a long-term waste management strategy in July 2016 that puts a priority on reducing waste and minimizing the amount that is sent to landfill. The strategy will guide waste management for the next 30 to 50 years and adopts an aspirational goal of zero waste generation, which is in line with the transformational level of diversion required of 95% to achieve the low-carbon scenario. Our first campaign to mobilize low-carbon neighborhoods will include a waste diversion approach and an angle, enabling neighborhoods to identify ways to minimize waste within their own communities and also help us move towards the goal. So, in summary, across all of Toronto's urban systems, to put us on track for the long-term low-carbon goal, we must implement the approved low-carbon actions that the City already has in place, like planned transit, the long-term waste strategy, the official plan, and many others. We must pick up the pace by funding and implementing the short-term Report 1 strategies that Council already approved in December 2016. And in this report, we propose 3 acceleration campaigns to convene the necessary stakeholders to allow us to maximize the kinds of community and co-benefit that can be realized from some of the greatest opportunities we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The next steps, as we mentioned at the beginning, include the consideration of this report at the Parks and Environment Committee next Thursday, May 4th, and pending committee approval, the report will then be forwarded to City Council for the May 24th meeting. I'd like to thank you all again for joining us, and I'll now hand things back over to our host, Stuart Dupfield.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Mary. And thank you all for submitting your questions. Just a reminder, you can submit your questions and comments through the WebEx comment function on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, or by tweeting @LiveGreenTO or @Atmospheric Fund with the hashtag TransformTO. Our TransformTO experts joining us for the question period today are Linda Swanson and Mark Beckering from the City of Toronto, and Mary Pickering from the Atmospheric Fund. We will do our best to address most of your questions during the next hour, but we'll also post an FAQ on the TransformTO website following the webinars. If you have any further comments or questions, please don't hesitate to email transform@toronto.ca. Thank you. And here is our first question. Is the 80% by 2050 target considered ambitious enough? If not, when will it be revised? Mark?
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. And so, as Stuart said, I'm Mark Beckering with the City's Environment and Energy Division. And thank you very much for participating tonight. So, in response to the question, it's a good question and something that actually we did talk a little bit about during the project, and the consideration is 80% actually ambitious enough, and should we be actually thinking about moving to a more aggressive target like a few other cities have done around adopting goals to be 100% renewable by the year 2050. We decided, however, to not address that issue at this time, sorry if I can say that. For a couple of reasons. The first is the council mandate that we were given was to figure out and identify what are the transformative changes that need to happen to the city's urban systems to achieve the 80 by 50 goal. And that is the goal that council did adopt in 2007. And as a reminder to everybody, that was a goal that was unanimously adopted by all 45 members of council at that time. So within the context of the work that was assigned to us, we felt it very important we stuck with addressing the goal that council's already adopted and figuring out what transformative changes are necessary to get to that. That said, as was highlighted in the presentation, the proposal that we're presenting to council is that there will be regular reporting and regular evaluation of implementation against the goals and targets that are proposed in this report. And I do believe that it'll be something that we should and will include in that regular review and evaluation is continued research to determine, do we have the right targets, not just the 80 by 50 target, but the other targets and goals that reflecting around energy efficiency in buildings, net zero emissions in transportation, and so on, so that we know that we're actually working towards the right goals and continue to achieve them. So in short, to answer, I guess, the question, if we're not going to change the 80 by 50 goal right now, when could that happen? I think it'd be something that might be considered as part of the next sort of review of this, of the strategy and its implementation. Stuart?
Thank you, Mark. We have another question. Which are the two targeted neighborhoods for this low-carbon implementation engagement campaign? Mary?
In terms of this area, we have not identified any particular neighborhoods for this work, but rather the task at hand would be to develop, in concert with our city colleagues across the different divisions and the community representatives, a set of criteria that we might use to choose neighborhoods for the pilots. So stay tuned on that. If we proceed to the next phase of work, we'll be looking for support to develop criteria for that selection.
Great. Thank you, Mary. Okay, moving on to another question. Question we have here, give me a moment, please. What does it mean to enhance community resilience?
Community resilience can mean a number of things. At the City of Toronto, when we talk about resilience, we're often speaking about the ability of a community to bounce back from shocks and stresses. So shocks like extreme weather events or power disruptions, and stresses like ongoing issues experienced in the city, including lack of access to affordable housing, and other social issues of concern. So when we talk about community resilience, we're talking about ways in which bringing communities together through mobilizing low-carbon neighborhoods can help build social bonds and help people identify the kinds of resources that are already present within their own communities and that can be enhanced through networks. We're really looking at ways in which both the social and infrastructure elements of a community can become more resilient and support overall goals of City of Toronto in terms of city building and improving the quality of life for residents.
Great. Thank you very much, Linda. We have another question as it relates to community benefit. Which low-carbon actions have the most potential to drive community benefits? I think Mary's going to answer that one.
One of the findings of the multi-criteria analysis is that it wasn't always the deepest carbon reduction activity that was seen to have the most community benefit. However, there are a lot of overlap areas. In terms of big community-wide benefit, the analysts felt that transit and active transportation had very significant local benefits associated with them. In terms of active transportation, it's because it increases the amount of physical activity that people have, and it's shown that there's a direct correlation between access to transit and active transportation infrastructure and reduced instances of diabetes and obesity-related disease, which is something that is, currently on track to be a health crisis among the Toronto population. So that's an example of an area where there's an important health benefit associated with the low carbon action. Another key area is associated with building retrofits, which of course, as we've said, is one key area of opportunity for emission reduction. And in this instance, it's because improving housing stock is seen to have many benefits, including indoor air quality benefits for residents. It's seen to support our interest in housing renewal, especially in the social housing sector. And if we decided to prioritize that sector for retrofit, it could bring significant benefits in terms of housing renewal there. And also, as we think about the scale and pace of action in this area, retrofitting literally every building in the city to a deep degree creates a lot of local employment that can't be undertaken anywhere else. It can't be offshored. It has to be undertaken here. And this is a wide variety of employment from, construction and repair right through to financing, project management, engineering. So there's a lot of work involved there, and that was seen as an important benefit of the building retrofit area as well.
Great. Thank you, Mary. So we have another question here. I believe Mark's going to answer this one. Are emissions from commuters into the city considered as city emissions?
So the short answer is yes. We worked very hard to identify all transportation source emissions in the city, and that includes all travel that occurs. So it's not just the emissions associated with the cars and trucks owned and operated by people that live in the city of Toronto, but rather we did look at the patterns of travel in and out of the city, commuters, people coming in for entertainment, shopping, etc., and also goods movement in terms of freight and truck traffic that comes in and out of the city also. So that is definitely part of the count of greenhouse gas emissions, is those emissions were generated by transportation sources within the boundaries of the City of Toronto.
Thank you very much, Mark. Another question here along the lines of energy storage. Just give me one moment to find it. One more moment. Sorry, folks. So, what are the current targets / considerations for an energy storage technology strategy as part of creating a distributed renewable energy system? Linda.
Thanks, Stuart. So when we looked at the low carbon scenario, we did model out based on a scan of other jurisdictions and their targets and aspirations. So the low carbon scenario includes a modeled energy storage capacity of 1,000 megawatts by 2050, and that has the potential to deliver 50 kilotons of greenhouse gas emission reductions in our model. We looked at that energy storage element because we recognize that energy storage in particular has a particular role to play in relation to renewable energy, which doesn't always generate distributed renewable energy generation, requires distributed energy storage to maximize its potential. And when we look at preparing for electric mobility, there are some really interesting opportunities in that space, as there's the opportunity for electric vehicles to actually act as distributed energy storage. So that's one of the things that would be looked at in terms of how to use electric mobility to support grid resilience and grid capacity in the kind of future evaluation and pilots that we would be looking at in the Preparing for Electric Mobility campaign.
Fabulous, thank you. Another question we have here relates to the short-term actions in the acceleration campaigns. How does Report 1 short-term actions relate to the acceleration campaigns?
Sorry. So the short-term actions that we presented in Report 1 in December of last year were things that we identified that we felt we could get started very quickly and needed to get started on now to start putting Toronto on the trajectory to the long-term goal of 80 by 50. The acceleration campaigns build upon those in the sense that the word acceleration is actually used quite deliberately, in the sense that we want to accelerate and increase the pace of that action that occurs. But the most important thing is, as the acceleration campaigns also are about finding the co-benefits that we've talked about a lot in the presentation and the report. And that through the campaigns, we're looking for the opportunity to bring other players and other people from the community to the table who aren't necessarily interested solely in carbon reduction, but rather have an interest in what opportunities there are to generate additional jobs, to address social equity issues and income inequality, and build those into those accelerated efforts to reduce the carbon that comes from building energy use or transportation sources, so that we actually, through the effort to address the low carbon goal, we're achieving the other goals that we've set through this project around equity, health, and prosperity.
Great, thank you, Mark. Another question here along the lines of co-benefits. Where did the need for a skilled workforce in high-performance buildings come from? Was it an economic analysis, or was it a more robust mixed methods approach?
Thanks. Yes. When we developed the idea for this campaign, it related directly to what we called the multi-criteria analysis exercises we did with our community representative group when they assessed the potential benefits they saw associated with some of the key low-carbon strategy areas. So in this instance, they identified the potential for a high level of employment associated with the kind of work that might need to be done to achieve the scale and pace of work in the building sector. Our economic analysis for this particular work relates to energy cost savings, energy flows, and carbon pricing analysis only. So we have not yet undertaken a full analysis of the job needs or the skill needs, and that is really seen to be the next key area of explorations for this file. So that's part of the objectives of this acceleration campaign, is to gain a greater understanding of what exactly we might see in terms of new job areas and how that might fit with existing training opportunities and workforce profile in Toronto.
Great, thank you, Mary. Another question here, they keep coming. Does the deep energy retrofitting of city-owned buildings include TCHC buildings, or Toronto Community Housing Projects? Linda.
Thank you, Stuart. So the short answer is yes. The retrofitting targets, long-term goals presented in the report for city-owned facilities include social housing. And we think this is a great area of opportunity, and in fact it's an area of opportunity that we've already seen significant action in since the first TransformTO report was adopted. So what we've seen in the first TransformTO report were some estimates around the capital required community-wide to achieve the short-term strategies in Report 1. And we've actually, since the report was adopted, been successful in leveraging almost 20% of that capital estimate, particularly in the area of social housing retrofit, where the SHARP program, combined with a loan provided through the recoverable debt option that the City of Toronto administers through the Better Building Partnership, has been successful in leveraging a $28.3 million grant. And we recognize that this investment will lead to significant energy efficiency savings in social housing, along with improved quality of housing environment for those social housing unit residents.
Thank you, Linda. A question here on the effectiveness and evaluation of the programs. When TransformTO is implemented, what ways or tools are going to be used to determine the effectiveness of what has been applied as performance evaluation markers? Mark?
This is a very important thing, right? It's one thing to actually set goals, but it's another to make sure that you're actually staying on track and taking correction when necessary. So if you look at the staff report and recommendation number 7 of the staff report, we do outline that we are planning to do a regular reporting to Council, starting in the first year of the next term of Council. So every 4 years, it's our intention to provide Council with a comprehensive review of what's been achieved, where are we at in relation to the goals that have been set, and what actions and changes we would recommend, at least for the next 3 or 4 years of that term of Council. And then in the third year of the term of Council, there will be a more shorter but quick report to Council, providing them with an update on what has been achieved in the first 2 years of their term. So the intent is to build the reporting on implementation of the strategy and what's been achieved, and linking it to the term of Council. With respect to the actual specific indicators and measures that we'll be tracking, we don't have it all mapped out just yet, but it'll be something that we will develop before we do that first report. But if you look at recommendation 7, we do suggest the kind of things that we need to measure. And some are obvious, such as we need to track where the GHGs are, the greenhouse gas emissions, I should say. But we also want to develop indicators to try and measure to what extent the co-benefits are being derived as we implement those low-carbon actions. We also sort of want to get a sense of to what degree people are engaged actually in helping the community or the City of Toronto as a whole achieve these goals. So we're looking to figure out ways that we can sort of track the level of participation, level of action that's occurring across the community. And it's important, I think, to sort of understand, this is what kind of investments are being made, not just by the City of Toronto, but the community as a whole. So again, the goal being to see if we can figure out some way of measuring the kind of financial investments that are occurring to move us towards the goal. So as I said, we don't necessarily have the key performance indicators just mapped out, but we definitely recognize it's a very important thing, and we will be doing the regular reporting to Council on a 4 and 2 year cycle to address this.
Thanks, Mark, for those details. Another question. With respect to Toronto's carbon budget, what is the maximum increase in global temperature you aspire to remain under? 1.5, 2 degrees, or higher? Mary?
In 2007, when Toronto set its emission reduction targets, they were basically created to align with the global accepted target of a 2 degree Celsius target. And that is a very common frame that's been used internationally by most cities. So our 80% reduction by 2050 is scaled to that 2% number, 2 degrees Celsius number. And that's in line with similar actions in Berlin, London, Washington, D.C., elsewhere. So that's why we model to that frame.
Thank you. Another question from the community here. I'd like to ask if there was any consideration for asking Toronto citizens to take a more active and personal role in lowering their and our carbon footprint. Linda?
Thanks, Stuart. So a couple of pieces. So the Mobilizing Low Carbon Neighborhoods Acceleration Campaign is directly connected to tapping into the potential of residents to make low carbon choices in their day-to-day lives when supported with the appropriate infrastructure and tools. So also seeking to support residents in identifying what are the best low carbon actions that they can take that make sense in their neighborhood. Obviously, the City of Toronto has a lot of diversity. It has a lot of diversity in terms of community demographics, in terms of built form. And we know that low carbon actions that make sense in Scarborough or former city of North York may not be the same kind of low carbon actions that would make sense in downtown Toronto. So really that mobilizing low carbon neighborhoods is about identifying what's appropriate in different spaces within the city. Additionally, one of the recommendations in the second report is for Toronto to actually investigate what a consumption-based emissions accounting inventory would look like and whether or not that would be appropriate in the context of Toronto. So currently, the emissions reporting that we undertake aligns with the Global Protocol on Community-Scale Greenhouse Gas Emission Inventories, and it looks at really the emissions that happen within the geographic boundary of our city. But what we're proposing, or what is proposed in this report, is to also, in tandem to that, look at the carbon footprint or the consumption-based emissions emitted by residents of our city. The reason we currently look at production-based emissions is that those are the emissions where municipal policy and program interventions have the most likelihood of success or ability to intervene. But increasingly, we're seeing that there is a potential for municipalities to also try and support low carbon choices based on consumption-based or carbon footprint understandings of emissions. So certainly this report is responsive to that idea of local or community level carbon action.
Thanks for those details, Linda. Another question here with respect to transportation. Why is the 2050 mode share target for transit use so low? Mary?
I think this is an important illustration of one of the challenges of the modeling overall, in that we had to take data and assumptions from available sources and use them to model out towards the future. So in some instances, we used data that showed what common practice was today in terms of transit. And this is one reason we feel that, we could do some support once our transit infrastructure and active transportation infrastructure is in place to normalize behavior to a degree that it isn't normalized today and to increase adoption. So that has affected some of the outcomes because of the assumptions inherent in the model. And I think that's something important for us all to bear in mind, that this model is constructed on a set of data, best available data that we have right now, and the best, most grounded assumptions that we could derive. But it's important for us to understand that over time, there will be new technologies, there will be new approaches, there will be new understanding, and we'll be incorporating those into modeling key actions as we go forward.
Thanks, Mary. We have another question here, another transportation question. The question reads, Are we going to have enough electricity for all the electric vehicles? Linda.
So one of the findings of the TransformTO low carbon scenario modeling was that in fact, if and when we are able to implement and move towards all of the kinds of transformational changes that we've modeled, the actual total energy used is less. So one of the biggest things that happens as we shift to a low-carbon community and a low-carbon city is that we actually reduce, because of our increased efficiency, the total amount of energy used. So when we looked at the amount of energy currently used in our baseline scenario, we saw, and I'm going to, forgive me, I have my units. We use about 222 PJs of energy. However, in the business as planned scenario, that decreases to 191. And then finally, in the low carbon scenario, that comes all the way down to 135. So those numbers themselves aren't critically important, but what we do see is that because of the increased efficiency of things like electric vehicles, which actually use less energy to power their movement than gasoline-powered cars, we're not only able to reduce our emissions, but we're also in a low-carbon future able to reduce our overall energy consumption. So while there'll certainly be challenges in the transition as we ensure that there's sufficient grid capacity at any given time to support the electrification of both mobility and space heating, overall, if properly managed, we will be able or have modeled a low-carbon future where there's less total energy used.
Thank you, Linda. Another question relates to electric vehicles. Are there plans to amend current restrictions on the use of e-bikes, e-scooters, segways, etc., to allow their use within Toronto? For example, would e-bikes be considered part of electric mobility in the future? Mark.
So the report itself, we don't dive into the details in the sense of, looking at if there are rules and regulations around a specific issue that need to be changed, at least not at this time. What I think I would like to emphasize, though, is the notion that all electric-powered vehicles, whether e-bikes, e-scooters, are going to definitely have to be part of the electrification of mobility. And so we don't consider the electrification of mobility simply take out the gas motor and put in an electric motor, and we continue to drive our four-door sedan cars. But we need to look at sort of how the electrification of different mobility options can work together with transit and walking and cycling to provide, the greatest opportunity for people to move around in a low-carbon way. So within the short-term strategies, as part of report number 1, we did identify the need to actually develop a more comprehensive electric vehicle strategy for the city. And I believe that in the development of that strategy and through the implementation of the campaign around electrifying mobility is where we can actually get into more deeper and thoughtful discussion about what are the different options and what barriers there may be to some of these different options, and whether we want to make changes to them, such as suggested in the question, potential barriers to the use of e-bikes.
Great, thank you, Mark. Another question here, I believe Mary's going to take this one. How do we fill the gap to reach 2050? # climate target.
The answer is we do everything that we modeled. There's 36 actions, and we have to do it all. And they're interrelated, some of them affecting others. For example, if you reduce the energy used by buildings, then you can get away with low-carbon community energy systems to support the remaining load. So there's some sequencing and interrelationship, but there are, as we were mentioning before, a few key measures that really carry the load in terms of reduction opportunity, and those are improved building efficiency, including new standards, near net zero energy standards for new buildings, a retrofit campaign for existing buildings to help them on average reduce their energy consumption by 40%, the adoption of electric vehicles across passenger vehicle and transit and freight segments. Community energy used with low carbon sources like waste heat, ground source heat, and deep lake water. Active transportation, a modal shift to active transportation to make sure that most trips under 5 kilometers are taken by active transportation and not vehicle. And also waste diversion in order to keep carbon-producing waste out of landfill. And that takes up the bulk of the gap, and there's a number of other critical actions, enabling actions, that make up the rest.
Thank you, Mary. Another question here. One moment, please. Will Toronto amend bylaws that discourage natural gardens that do not promote the use of two-stroke engines such as lawnmowers, leaf blowers, and other lawn care equipment, especially given that lawns offer far lower environmental benefits?
So in the staff report, we do talk a bit about the issue of the use of small engine lawn and garden equipment. It's in Appendix C, page 3 of Appendix C, if the person who asked the question wants to look at the details of what we wrote around this issue. We do recognize that the emissions that come from the small engine is harmful to the environment and has a potential health impact. However, at this time, we're not recommending that we take any action from an environmental health perspective around banning or regulating or controlling the use of small engine lawn and garden equipment. What we do recognize, though, is the city is currently undergoing a comprehensive review of the noise bylaw, and council has already given the staff responsible for that initiative very clear direction to look at regulations that could and options that are available to potentially restrict or regulate the use of this type of equipment. And we feel, in the context of everything else that we're trying to achieve within the TransformTO initiative, that's probably the better place at this time for discussions about any rules or regulations around controlling small engine lawn and garden equipment.
Thank you, Mark. Another question here. Can we expect City Council to approve the budgeted amounts in the TransformTO report? If there are concerns that the funds will not be available, does that require prioritizing the actions to be taken, or should the response be a reconsideration of targets and timelines? Linda.
So in Report 2, we identify in the financial implications section the forecasted operating costs associated with the Report 1 strategies that City Council has already approved. We know, as was mentioned, that over the long term, the majority of the modeled actions have a positive business case. So they will pay for themselves in terms of operating cost savings, efficiency savings, and again, that doesn't take into account the avoided costs achieved in terms of avoided healthcare costs or avoided negative costs to the community. We know that dollars spent on low carbon actions tend to leverage and draw other dollars with the Better Buildings Partnership, which retrofits existing buildings. On average, we see for every dollar of investment in energy efficiency provided through city loan programs, between $10 and $14 are attracted to that investment from the private sector. When we've talked about the community-wide costs of capital, so the capital investment required, those definitely are community-wide costs. There's not the expectation that those will be borne by the city independently. As we mentioned earlier, we've already seen that happen with other orders of government pitching in to support the retrofit of social housing. We know that to be on track for the long-term low-carbon target, all actions and all short-term and Report 1 strategies do need to be advanced. And we see the possibility for momentum. One of the short-term strategies that was funded in 2017 was resourcing to seek out financing from other sources, including other orders of government, so the province and the federal government, and also to look at private investment opportunities, which could include things like green bonds or community bonds to support the implementation of these low carbon actions.
Great, thank you, Linda. Now a question as it relates to energy. Are there any plans to reduce the use of non-renewable gas and replace it with biogas or electricity? Mary.
Yeah, thanks for this question. It's a critical one because, in essence, much of the carbon produced in Toronto relates to the use of non-renewable gas for heating of water and space in buildings. And so that's a key target area. And the whole buildings scenario relies on us reducing the use of non-renewable gas, first by improving energy performance or energy efficiency in buildings through retrofits or through the application of new, more strict building standards. And secondly, we would be replacing those heating sources once the overall load is drawn down with low carbon sources that would replace natural gas, including electricity-based ground source, district systems fueled by waste heat, for example. And on top of this, there's some explicit goals in the plan for the city itself to generate some renewable natural gas using wastewater. And the target there is to utilize 1.5 million gigajoules from renewable natural gas by 2030, generated through facilities on our own solid waste management facilities.
Thank you, Mary. Another question here. I believe Mark's going to take this one. How did you calculate Toronto's share of the global carbon budget? Did you use Toronto's share of global population or another way?
So the answer here is we actually did not do this. We did not use a global carbon budget to calculate Toronto's global carbon budget. Rather, what we've focused on is Council's adopted target, and that target being, as we mentioned earlier, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% against 1990 levels by the year 2050. So we're very focused on what is Toronto's emissions profile and reducing that down to the 80%. We're not actually looking at Toronto in the context of its contribution to the larger global greenhouse gas emission profile.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Another question here. I believe Linda's going to answer this one. I'm just going to get a little closer. I think some people might not have heard us on those ones. Here we go. One moment. Okay, there's a lot of questions, folks. There are still large amounts of plastic water bottles being used during City of Toronto Council meetings. So how many plastic water bottles are ending up in the Arctic? Any solutions?
Thanks, Stuart. We recognize that waste and waste management is one of the critical urban systems in reaching Toronto's low-carbon goals and also in achieving the long-term waste management goals set out in the Council-adopted long-term waste management strategy. One of the things that is new that was introduced in the long-term waste management strategy is not only a focus on diversion, but also a focus on waste minimization and, in fact, the tracking of a new metric related to waste generated per capita. So when we talk about things like plastic water bottles, there's certainly the opportunity to recycle plastic water bottles, which is an important first step in reducing the waste that is sent to landfill. But also with the long-term waste management strategy's new focus on waste minimization, you'll see increasing efforts and community, as in the Mobilizing Low Carbon Neighborhoods campaign, to seek ways to support folks in making choices that are the lowest carbon, which include reuse. So certainly TransformTO supports those reuse-focused outreach and engagement efforts.
We're just looking through the questions here, folks. Just one moment. So there's a question here along the lines of decision-making of the short term. How will decisions over the next 5 years inform the plan moving forward?
So if you could just repeat the question, Mary.
Sure. This question is about how decisions over the next 5 years might have an impact with respect to our 2050 timeline. And this is a really important area to discuss because although this is a very long-term project from now to 35 or 33 years from now, it doesn't mean we can delay. And in fact, as we make decisions this year, next year, and in fact in the next 5 years, we're going to have to apply a carbon lens to each and every one of these major decisions. Because if we don't, we may be locking in carbon reductions for decades to come that we can't undo. And an example of this might be if we allow new buildings, which have a lifespan of 50 to 100 years, to be constructed without thinking about their draw on our energy resources in the city, we're going to have a situation where we have a huge carbon cost to pay and to offset, and either we have to undo those buildings by retrofitting, or we have to slash down our carbon emissions in other areas. So when things come to their natural end in terms of infrastructure, or as we turn over stocks of vehicles or equipment, we need to take the opportunity to make the proactive decision. And this is starting to happen right away. And if we don't make these decisions now, we're not going to be able to reach the target. So really now is the time to get very serious about applying this carbon lens to all city decision making.
Great, thank you, Mary. We've received a number of questions again on transportation, and folks want to understand how transit and transportation were accounted for in the model and the emissions associated with them.
Thank you, Stuart. And as Stuart said, there's been, excuse me, I'm sorry, there's been a few questions where people are asking about specific transit initiatives and which ones were included in the model and whether we did any evaluation of not building certain transit lines or building ones that were not currently planned. What I would direct people to look at is the consultant's report, Appendix B, on page 56. There is a fairly detailed discussion and description of the various different transit projects that were integrated into the model. And the important thing to note is, our starting point was the currently funded and in some cases currently under construction, rapid transit projects, and those would include the Eglinton Crosstown, Finch West LRT, the Shepherd East LRT, and the extension of the Spadina subway to York University and to the city of Vaughan. So that was our starting point, was the currently funded and under construction. And then we looked at the discussions that have occurred around future rapid transit projects, and those were, as I said, on page 56, there's a long list of planned rapid transit expansion that were then built into the model for the low carbon scenario.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. Again, if people want those details, page 56 of the technical report. Another question here. How will we coordinate climate work with other city initiatives? Mary?
As we've been talking about, one of the key findings of this report is that there's a lot of potential to drive benefits as we undertake low carbon actions, but this has to be designed. We're talking about potential to drive these benefits. They will not occur unless the low carbon actions are designed specifically to achieve them. And that requires that we work in tandem with other divisions within the city. And you'll see in the report that we have actually had a recommendation there, for example, that asks, as we develop our resilience strategy, which is coming on stream under the auspices of a new Chief Resilience Officer, we've asked that that strategy be undertaken considering the TransformTO goals, and we'll need to be reaching out to collaborate, as we have in the development of this plan, with our colleagues in city planning who oversee building standards, with our colleagues in the transportation sector who oversee the transit planning, and also with our colleagues who oversee city actions related to poverty reduction. And they are already advancing neighborhood-based objectives, and we will need to be able to understand, by working in tandem with them and setting up project strategy with them, how to use the carbon strategies, for example, in terms of achieving more affordable housing by reducing the operating costs of buildings through retrofits, and or shielding vulnerable Toronto residents who may be living in social housing from health problems associated with poor ventilation in buildings that can be corrected through energy retrofits.
Great, thank you, Mary. Another question is, this relates to Toronto's work globally. How does this work align with global best practice, and how was it informed by global best practice?
So if I could start out, I might start my answer actually with just a little bit of a brag. I think, Toronto is actually one of those global leaders, and we're quite the envy, I think, of most cities in North America in terms of the level of greenhouse gas emissions that we have actually managed to achieve in terms of a reduction. There are very few other cities in North America that are on seeing the same rate of reduction as we've had. That said, we definitely don't have it all figured out, and we definitely can learn from other cities. And in the modeling exercise, one of the key things that we did do is made a very comprehensive effort to look at best practices and other initiatives that are occurring in cities across the world, with a particular focus on North American cities because of the similarity in terms of urban structure and political systems. So we did build a lot of those best practices into the modeling, and we have definitely been taking advantage of forums where they create the opportunity for sharing experiences between cities. For example, the City of Toronto is part of the C40 Global Cities Network, which is a network of cities around the world that are taking action on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a lot of opportunity for us to share our experiences and learn from what others are doing. And so, key message here is Toronto is, to some degree, a leader, but we're definitely looking to the other cities to help us figure out how we can achieve our 80 by 50 goal.
Thank you, Mark. So just a reminder to everyone that please feel free to send any additional questions in through @LiveGreenTO or @Atmospheric Fund with the hashtag TransformTO, or alternatively through the WebEx Q&A box. So another question here: how does this plan relate to the provincial climate change plan? Mary.
I think that we can understand that the targets set by the province, which are equally as ambitious as those adopted by the city, cannot be met unless cities do their part to expedite emissions using tools under their control. So cities are a critical component of both provincial and national emission reduction strategies, because this is where our people live, and this is where a lot of emissions is occurring. So there's a strong link there, and while there are a lot of tools and levers that the city itself has, City of Toronto in particular, with its own special powers under the City of Toronto Act, we must look to the province in order to enable some key local emission reduction strategies. For example, the province sets the building code, which governs what kind of energy performance we can require in buildings. So not only do we need to look to the province in terms of regulation and other areas of policy, we need to consider how we can access as cities the new resources that the province is developing through its cap and trade system and the new funding that's going to flow from that. So in fact, the city has already supported the creation of a new position. It's quite unique position within a sustainability office of a finance manager to seek out ways to mobilize capital that might be available from federal or provincial green banks or other policies, and also to support and pave the way for investment opportunities from the private sector to flow capital into low carbon solutions. So there's a lot of important interaction between the climate plan at the provincial level and at the city level, and we must give full attention to integrating the strategies and making full use of both in order to improve our outputs in Toronto.
Great, thank you, Mary. Another question here as it relates to the work of other municipalities. Is this approach for the city in line with what surrounding municipalities are doing, for example, Mississauga, or is the city more of a leader by the way others may model their approach? This is the first time that any city has modeled how they will reach their target based on globally recognized actions.
Great. I get all the questions related to what other people are doing and how they're learning from Toronto or we're learning from them. So the short answer is definitely I think most municipalities in the GTA are taking the issue seriously also, just like Toronto. And we have forums where the municipalities within the Greater Toronto Area, or actually even the larger Golden Horseshoe, share experiences and learn from one another also. A few examples of where the City of Toronto has shown leadership and is now starting to see that being replicated in other municipalities in the GTA would be things like our Toronto Green Standard. The Toronto Green Standard is an initiative of our City Planning Division where they encourage through the standard new development to exceed the minimum standards in things like the Ontario Building Code. For example, under Tier 1, we look for new development to achieve an energy performance that's 15% better than the minimum required under the Ontario Building Code. We've done a number of workshops with other municipalities in the GTA to sort of share our experiences in developing that standard, and now other municipalities are starting to adopt it, or something similar, obviously to suit the context and the type of development that occurs in their community. Another example would be our home energy loan program and our high-rise program, where we're providing low-interest long-term loans towards the implementation of deep energy retrofits in single-family homes and multi-residential homes. Again, this is a fairly unique program in the sense that it takes advantage of a feature of the Municipal Act called the Local Improvement Charges. And there's a number of municipalities actually across Ontario, and including the province of Ontario through the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, that have been watching our experiences over the last couple of years with these two programs to see whether the potential for these programs to be delivered in other cities and then maybe even province-wide. So Toronto is leading, but that said, as I mentioned earlier, we definitely don't know all the solutions, and there are things that we learn from our partners within the GTA also.
Great, thank you, Mark. Sort of continuation of that question in some respects. I believe Mary's going to answer this one. Are there avenues or opportunities for information sharing between neighboring municipalities?
Thanks, Stuart. And I'm really glad that a lot of the questions here have to do with this theme of collaboration, which has come out so strongly as we undertook this work. And certainly, as Mark has outlined, we have to work with our regional counterparts. In many ways, city boundaries are a very artificial context for undertaking considerations of carbon reductions. First, for the reason that Linda was mentioning earlier, because a lot of our goods that we consume here are produced elsewhere, so we need to take that into account, and we plan on doing that in the next phase through a consumption-based inventory. But secondly, because a lot of the flows of energy in terms of our whole energy system, in terms of transportation, freight, and goods movement, this all flows on a regional basis it's more of a commuter shed that might be the relevant unit that we want to consider rather than individual municipalities. And I just wanted to mention at this stage that my agency, the Atmospheric Fund, has been supported by the City of Toronto for over 25 years to support climate action work within the city. But last year, the province provided a new set of resources for the Atmospheric Fund to extend its support across the region. And we're very happy about this new opportunity, because not only does it give some more resources to help cities who are the critical agents of climate reduction in Ontario, but it also allows us to think differently about emission reduction in ways that we haven't modeled in this particular model, but that we might do if we start to look at regional emission reduction strategy. And we're moving in that direction and thinking how we might tackle some of these programs with a regional lens in collaboration with municipalities across the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. So stay tuned on that front. We might have some new ways to ratchet down carbon as a region.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Mark, and thank you, Linda, for answering those questions tonight. And thank you all for your participation. That's all the time we have for tonight. This webinar presentation will be posted on the TransformTO webpage in the next few days. If you would like to sign up for the TransformTO newsletter and updates, or to stay in touch, please visit our website at toronto.ca/TransformTO, or contact us with the hashtag TransformTO. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great evening.